Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. Edward Harper cherished the solitude of his 60-acre farm, a sanctuary untouched by the chaos of modern life. But when Karen, the tyrannical HOA president from the neighboring Golden Ridge Estates, declared his land under her jurisdiction, his peaceful life spiraled into a relentless battle for justice and freedom. Edward Harper stood on the edge of his sprawling 60-acre property, the warm mountain breeze rustling through the towering oaks that bordered his land. This was his sanctuary, a place steeped in family history and personal freedom. The farmhouse, weathered but charming, had been built by his great-grandfather and expanded over the years to include a barn, a vineyard, and a serene fishing pond. For Edward, a retired Army engineer, the property wasn't just home, it was a legacy he'd fought to preserve. Life here was simple, yet fulfilling. Mornings began with the soft hum of nature as Edward checked on the vineyard and maintained the equipment in the barn. He relished the solitude, interrupted only by the occasional visit from his neighbor, Sam, a lifelong friend who lived down the road. Most days, Edward would sit on his porch, watching the sunset cast golden hues over the valley. The peace of his life was a sharp contrast to the bustling development that had sprung up a few years ago on the other side of the hill, Golden Ridge Estates. This luxury housing community, all perfectly aligned houses and manicured lawns, seemed worlds apart from Edward's rustic lifestyle. He rarely thought about the Homeowners Association, HOA, that governed the community, assuming their rules wouldn't cross the invisible boundary separating their neatly paved streets from his untamed land. However, the calm was shattered one crisp autumn morning. Edward was inspecting the barn's roof when he noticed something unusual: bright orange spray-painted markers on the edge of his land. His stomach churned as he approached the markers. Someone had been here, trespassing, without so much as a word. Later that week, a certified letter arrived bearing the logo of Golden Ridge Estates HOA. The letter claimed Edward's property was now considered part of the HOA jurisdiction and demanded that he comply with their regulations. Among the list of infractions were absurdities like excessive vegetation, unauthorized structures, his barn, and the audacity to include unsanctioned agricultural activities. Edward laughed at first, shaking his head at the ridiculousness of it all. He drafted a response, attaching copies of his property deeds, and sent it back. He expected the matter to end there, assuming it was some clerical mistake, but he underestimated the HOA's tenacity and its president, Karen. Karen was a force to be reckoned with, known for her relentless enforcement of HOA policies and her obsession with maintaining community standards. Edward had heard stories from others, neighbors who whispered about her intimidating tactics, families who'd sold their homes to escape her reign. Her arrival at his doorstep 2 weeks later, clipboard in hand and an entourage of HOA members trailing behind her, was the moment Edward realized his simple life was under siege. The meeting was tense. Karen, dressed immaculately in a blazer and heels unsuited for Edward's gravel driveway, wasted no time issuing ultimatums. She demanded that he mow his grass to acceptable levels, dismantle his barn unless it could meet their architectural guidelines, and cease all farming activities. Edward calmly explained that his land was not, and never had been, part of Golden Ridge Estates. Karen, undeterred, smiled coldly and informed him that her legal team had reassessed the property lines and found otherwise. Edward's refusal to comply seemed to energize Karen. As she left, she turned back and said, "Mr. Harper, I suggest you reconsider. Non-compliance with HOA policies can result in severe consequences." Watching her retreat, Edward clenched his fists. This wasn't just about regulations. It was a blatant attempt to seize control of what had been his family's land for generations. As the sun dipped behind the hills, Edward vowed that if Karen and her HOA thought they could bully him, they were in for a rude awakening. This was his land, his home, and he would fight for it. The weeks following Karen's visit turned Edward's life into a whirlwind of escalating harassment. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. He noticed strangers at the edges of his property, cameras in hand, snapping photos of his barn, vineyard, and even his porch. When he approached one of them, the man mumbled something about documenting non-compliance before hastily retreating to his car. Then came the letters, thicker, more aggressive, and increasingly absurd. One demanded that Edward replace the rustic split-rail fencing around his property with HOA-approved wrought iron to match community aesthetics. Another accused him of operating an unregistered business because he sold a few bottles of his homemade wine at the local farmers market. The fines listed in each letter grew exponentially, starting at $500 and quickly climbing into the thousands. Karen, however, was far from finished. She began to mobilize the residents of Golden Ridge Estates, painting Edward as a negligent neighbor whose unkempt property threatened their pristine community. Flyers circulated around the development, warning of potential drops in property values due to the eyesore on the other side of the hill. Karen even arranged a community meeting, during which she stood in front of a crowd and declared Edward's property a blight that needed to be dealt with swiftly. Edward remained defiant, but the harassment took its toll. One morning, he awoke to the sound of heavy machinery. Racing outside, he found a landscaping crew digging into the edge of his property. The foreman, startled by Edward's appearance, explained they were there to trim overgrowth, as per HOA instructions. Furious, Edward ordered them off his land and called the sheriff. While the crew left without further incident, the damage had already been done. Several of Edward's prized oak trees had been hacked down, leaving jagged stumps as a reminder of Karen's overreach. Things grew worse. Karen filed multiple complaints with local government agencies, accusing Edward of violating environmental codes and claiming his barn was a fire hazard. Inspectors arrived unannounced, scrutinizing every inch of his property. While Edward had all the necessary permits and passed every inspection, the constant interruptions began to feel like a siege. Karen also played dirty. Late one evening, Edward caught two teenagers spray painting vulgar messages on his barn. When he confronted them, they nervously admitted they'd been promised cash by Karen to send a message. Edward recorded their confession, but the sheriff dismissed it as kids being kids and refused to investigate further. Despite everything, Edward refused to bow. He installed security cameras to document every intrusion, carefully filed each threatening letter, and kept detailed records of the HOA's actions. Yet Karen wasn't done escalating. A week later, Edward returned from a grocery run to find survey stakes and orange tape strung across the middle of his vineyard. A crew had begun digging trenches, claiming they were preparing the ground for community amenities, including a walking trail and a dog park. Edward's patience snapped. He marched straight to the HOA office, a sleek building that stood in stark contrast to his rustic home. Karen greeted him with a smirk, surrounded by her hand-picked board members. "This is the last time I'll ask you nicely," Edward growled. "Get off my land and stop this nonsense, or I'll take legal action." Karen didn't flinch. "Mr. Harper, I'm afraid you misunderstand. Your property is now under our jurisdiction. The residents of Golden Ridge Estates have spoken. They've petitioned to integrate your land into the HOA, and the county has approved our preliminary request. This is for the betterment of the community." Edward felt a cold wave of disbelief. "That's a lie. I've seen no such approval." Karen handed him a folder filled with doctored documents, complete with forged signatures and official-looking seals. "Feel free to consult your lawyer," she sneered. "But I suggest you comply. You wouldn't want to rack up more fines. Or worse." Edward left, fury burning in his chest. He wasn't just fighting for his property anymore. He was fighting against a machine of manipulation and greed. As he reviewed the false documents that night, one thing became clear. Karen and her HOA had crossed a line, and he would stop at nothing to expose them. The conflict had escalated beyond harassment. It was now a full-scale war. Edward knew the time for warnings was over. Karen and her HOA had escalated beyond bullying. Now they were outright stealing his land. Armed with security footage, forged documents, and the spray paint confession from the teenagers, Edward made an urgent call to his lawyer, Vanessa Cole, a sharp and fearless attorney specializing in property law. Vanessa arrived the next morning, her tailored suit and calm demeanor exuding confidence. She spent hours reviewing Edward's meticulous records before declaring, "They're not just trespassing, they're committing fraud on a scale that could bring the whole HOA crashing down. But we'll need to catch them red-handed for this to stick." The opportunity came sooner than expected. Late one evening, Edward's security cameras captured a group of workers under the cover of darkness dismantling his barn. They worked quickly, loading planks of wood onto trucks while Karen stood nearby, barking orders. Enraged, Edward called Vanessa, who urged him to contact the sheriff immediately. When the sheriff arrived, Karen was still on site, her arms crossed as she oversaw the destruction. She greeted the deputies with feigned innocence. "This is authorized work," she claimed, holding up yet another forged document. Mr. Harper's barn was a safety hazard, and the HOA voted unanimously to have it removed. Edward arrived moments later, his phone in hand, showing the sheriff live footage from his cameras. "This is trespassing, vandalism, and theft," he declared, his voice trembling with controlled fury. "They're destroying my property with no legal authority." The sheriff hesitated, clearly caught between Karen's confident bluster and Edward's damning evidence. Vanessa arrived shortly after, armed with Edward's property deeds and the original zoning records proving the land had never been part of the HOA. Confronted with irrefutable proof, the sheriff had no choice but to halt the work and detain the crew for questioning. Karen's mask of control began to slip. "This is all a misunderstanding," she said, her voice quivering. "I was only trying to maintain community standards. Surely we can resolve this without involving lawyers." But Edward wasn't backing down. "You've vandalized my property, stolen my resources, and lied about your authority. This isn't a misunderstanding. It's a crime." In the days that followed, the confrontation at the barn became the talk of the town. Local news outlets picked up the story, broadcasting footage of Karen's trespassing and highlighting the scale of the HOA's corruption. Edward and Vanessa filed a formal lawsuit accusing Karen and the HOA of fraud, harassment, and destruction of property. The HOA's response was swift and venomous. Karen, backed by the HOA's legal team, countered with a lawsuit of her own, claiming Edward was willfully endangering the community by refusing to comply with their jurisdiction. She portrayed herself as a protector of Golden Ridge Estates, framing Edward as a stubborn recluse, clinging to outdated ways. The courtroom became the stage for the ultimate showdown. Witness after witness testified, including the teenagers Karen had paid to vandalize the barn. Under cross-examination, Vanessa revealed inconsistencies in Karen's statements, pointing out that no legal precedent existed for forcibly annexing Edward's property into the HOA. Karen's downfall came when Vanessa presented forensic evidence proving the documents Karen had used were forged. The seals were mismatched, and signatures from county officials didn't align with their verified records. The judge, visibly frustrated, demanded an explanation. Karen stammered, her composure cracking. I only wanted to do what was best for the community," she said, her voice trembling. But the final blow came from the county assessor, who testified that Karen had bribed his office to support her fraudulent claims. This testimony, combined with Vanessa's airtight evidence, left no doubt. Karen had orchestrated a systematic campaign of harassment and fraud to annex Edward's land for the HOA's benefit. The courtroom fell silent as the judge delivered the ruling. "Ms. Karen Mitchell, your actions go beyond civil disputes. You've engaged in criminal activity, including fraud, trespassing, and property destruction. This court finds you and the HOA guilty on all counts." Karen's face turned pale as she realized the gravity of her actions. The judge announced immediate penalties, including significant fines for the HOA and a recommendation for Karen's criminal prosecution. As Edward sat in the courtroom, hearing the verdict, a wave of relief washed over him. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in months, he felt the tide turning in his favor. Karen's reign of terror was finally coming to an end. The day after the court's ruling, the once pristine image of Golden Ridge Estates and its iron-fisted HOA began to unravel. Karen Mitchell, their once imposing leader, now faced a flood of lawsuits, criminal charges, and public disgrace. News outlets eagerly covered the fallout, labeling her the HOA tyrant and dissecting her schemes in painstaking detail. Edward Harper, meanwhile, found himself in an unusual position. His quiet, solitary life had been replaced by meetings with lawyers, interviews with reporters, and the constant support of neighbors from both sides of the hill. People who once feared HOA reprisal now rallied behind him, inspired by his refusal to be bullied. But the resolution was far from simple. The first priority was to assess and repair the damage to Edward's property. The destruction was staggering. His barn lay in splinters, his vineyard had been uprooted in multiple places, and the boundary markers placed by the HOA had scarred the land. Contractors estimated tens of thousands of dollars in repairs, but Vanessa assured Edward he would recover every cent through the legal settlement. Karen, however, wasn't getting off lightly. The judge had not only ordered her immediate removal from the HOA presidency, but also declared her personally liable for significant damages. Karen was stripped of her authority, and the HOA itself was placed under a court-mandated audit. An independent firm was assigned to overhaul the organization's operations, ensuring transparency and accountability. Karen's criminal trial followed swiftly. Charged with fraud, trespassing, and conspiracy, she faced the grim prospect of several years in prison. Her defense team tried to argue she had acted in the community's best interest, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. Witnesses, including the county assessor she had bribed, detailed her relentless manipulation. The forged documents sealed her fate. Karen was sentenced to 6 years in prison, a resounding message that abuse of power would not go unpunished. Meanwhile, the HOA board members, eager to distance themselves from Karen, resigned en masse. Some claimed ignorance of her actions, while others expressed regret for not speaking out sooner. Vanessa, never one to miss an opportunity, used this chaos to negotiate a hefty settlement for Edward. In addition to the $750,000 awarded for damages and legal fees, the HOA was ordered to issue a public apology to Edward, retract all fines, and cease any attempts to annex his land. For the residents of Golden Ridge Estates, the revelations were a wake-up call. Many had blindly supported Karen, believing her actions were for the greater good. Now they saw her for what she truly was, a manipulative tyrant willing to destroy anyone who stood in her way. As the HOA's grip loosened, neighbors began to reassess their priorities. One afternoon, a group of residents visited Edward's farm. Among them were families who had initially supported Karen's campaign against him. They stood awkwardly at the edge of his driveway until Edward came out to greet them. "We owe you an apology," said Sarah, a young mother who had been one of Karen's staunchest supporters. "We didn't know how far she'd go. You didn't deserve any of this." Edward nodded, appreciating their sincerity. "I appreciate you saying that, but what's done is done. Let's move forward." And move forward they did. Over the following months, Edward saw a transformation in the community. Without Karen's domineering presence, Golden Ridge Estates became a quieter, friendlier place. The residents began organizing block parties, community gardens, and other initiatives that emphasized cooperation over control. Edward used the settlement money to rebuild and improve his farm. He constructed a new barn, restored his vineyard, and invested in security measures to prevent future intrusions. But he didn't stop there. He also opened a small farm-to-table winery that quickly became a local favorite. The relationship between Edward and his neighbors improved as well. What had once been a cold war of mistrust turned into gestures of goodwill. Residents frequently visited his winery, bringing their families to enjoy the scenic views of the valley. Edward even began hosting annual harvest festivals, inviting the entire community to celebrate together. As for Karen, she disappeared from public life after her sentencing. Rumors swirled about her struggles to adjust to life behind bars, but Edward paid them no mind. She was a relic of a painful chapter that was now firmly closed. Months later, at a community meeting organized by the newly restructured HOA, Edward was invited as a guest speaker. He stood before a packed room, addressing the residents with a calm but firm voice. "This land, my land, has been in my family for generations. It's more than property to me. It's my home, my history. What happened here was a reminder of how easily power can be misused, but it also showed me the strength of people standing together, even when the odds are stacked against them." The room erupted in applause, a symbol of the unity that had emerged from the ashes of Karen's reign. As Edward returned to his farm that evening, he looked out over his 60 acres, now more peaceful than ever. The scars left by the conflict were fading, replaced by new growth and a renewed sense of purpose. His battle with Karen and the HOA had tested him in ways he never imagined, but it had also brought him closer to the community and strengthened his resolve to protect his home. Edward smiled as he thought of the future. His farm, once a target of greed and ambition, had become a beacon of resilience, and that was worth every fight he had faced. Months after the courtroom drama, Edward Harper's life had transformed in ways he never anticipated. His farm, once the center of a bitter conflict, now symbolized resilience and the triumph of integrity over greed. With the settlement money, Edward not only rebuilt his property, but improved it, turning his 60 acres into a picturesque retreat that attracted locals and visitors alike. The new barn stood tall, a testament to perseverance, while the vineyard flourished under Edward's careful attention. His farm-to-table winery became a cherished community hub, offering tastings, tours, and a space for neighbors to connect. The annual Harvest Festival he initiated drew families from Golden Ridge Estates and beyond, fostering a sense of unity that had long been missing. Golden Ridge Estates underwent its own transformation. The HOA, now under new transparent leadership, shifted its focus from enforcement to community building. Programs like neighborhood cleanups and support for elderly residents replaced Karen's draconian policies. Edward, once seen as an outsider, became a beloved figure in the area. His courage inspired others to stand up against injustice and reminded everyone that strength and integrity could spark lasting change. A year after the events that reshaped his life, Edward Harper stood on the porch of his farmhouse, looking out over his land. The vineyard shimmered under the late afternoon sun, rows of grapevines lush and heavy with fruit. Nearby, children laughed and played at the edge of the pond, their parents sipping wine on picnic blankets spread across the meadow. The annual Harvest Festival had grown into a beloved tradition, bringing together not only the residents of Golden Ridge Estates, but also people from the surrounding towns. Edward had transformed his farm into a beacon of community, a far cry from the isolation and tension of the previous year. Meanwhile, the reformed HOA of Golden Ridge Estates continued its work, now focused on fostering cooperation rather than control. Residents marveled at the newfound harmony in their neighborhood, often crediting Edward for setting the example. The scars left by Karen's tyranny were fading, replaced by a culture of mutual respect and understanding. As the sun dipped lower, Edward welcomed a new group of visitors. Among them was Sarah, who had once championed Karen's cause but now brought her family to enjoy the farm regularly. She greeted Edward with a warm smile. "It's hard to believe how much has changed," she said, glancing at the happy scene. Edward nodded, his gaze steady. "Change takes time, but it's worth it. It starts with standing your ground and refusing to let fear dictate your life." As the stars began to appear, Edward felt an overwhelming sense of peace. His farm was no longer just a personal sanctuary. It was a symbol of resilience, transformation, and the enduring power of community. And in the laughter and joy that filled the evening air, he saw the future he had fought so hard to protect, a future where his land and legacy could thrive for generations to come.